The door didn't just close, it decided who mattered and who didn't. Rain fell in thin, relentless sheets, tapping against the iron gates and polished stone like it had all night to wait, but Sophie Bennett didn't. Her fingers trembled around the damp edge of a folded hospital bill, the ink beginning to blur as water soaked through the paper, her other arm wrapped tightly around her baby boy, who stirred weakly against her chest, his tiny breasts warm but uneven beneath layers that weren't thick enough for a night like this. The mansion behind that door stood silent now, lights glowing softly through tall windows, the kind of place where warmth existed without question, where problems were handled before they ever reached the front step, and for a moment, Sophie just stood there, staring at the dark wood as if it might open again on its own, as if someone inside might realize they had made a mistake. Just minutes earlier, Daniel Whitmore had stood exactly where she was looking now, tall, composed, his voice calm but distant, the kind of calm that didn't leave room for argument, and when she had tried to explain, tried to show him the bill, tried to say anything that might make him see her as more than a stranger on his doorstep, he had only glanced once before shaking his head, not cruel, not loud, just certain, and certainty was heavier than anger because it left no space for hope. "I'm sorry," he had said, though it didn't sound like he was, "I can't help you." And then the door had closed. Not slammed, not aggressively, just firmly enough to say the conversation was over. Sophie shifted her weight slightly, her shoes soaked through, her toes numb from standing on cold stone for too long, but she didn't move away, not yet, because walking away meant accepting that this was the end of whatever fragile chance had brought her here in the first place. Inside the house, unseen by her, a small figure stood halfway down the grand staircase, watching through the narrow gap between the curtains, his eyes fixed on the woman who hadn't left, who hadn't even turned around, as if something was holding her in place stronger than the rain or the cold. Ethan Whitmore tilted his head slightly, confusion knitting his brows in a way children never learn to hide, because to him, the world was still simple enough to question. "Dad," he called softly, his voice echoing faintly through the open space, but Daniel didn't answer right away, standing near the entryway with his back still to the door, his jaw tightening just slightly as if something about the moment refused to settle the way it should have. Outside, Sophie adjusted the blanket around her baby, whispering something too quiet to hear, her lips close to his forehead, her breath shaky but steady enough to keep him calm, and even through the glass, Ethan noticed that she wasn't crying, not in the way he expected, not loudly or dramatically, just a quiet stillness that felt heavier than tears. He took a step closer to the door, small fingers brushing against the polished handle, and for a second, he hesitated, glancing back toward his father as if waiting for permission that never came, before looking forward again, his reflection faint in the glass, layered over the image of the woman standing outside. "Dad," he said again, a little louder this time, "why didn't you help her?" The question hung in the air, simple and direct, cutting through the quiet in a way no adult ever managed, and Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as if searching for an answer that would make sense outside his own reasoning. "It's complicated," he replied finally, his tone measured, controlled, the kind of answer meant to end a conversation rather than continue it, but Ethan didn't move, didn't look away, and something about that silence, that steady presence, pressed against Daniel's certainty in a way he wasn't prepared for. Outside, Sophie shifted again, her knees weakening slightly, but she stayed, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular now, just waiting, as if leaving too soon might mean missing something she couldn't afford to lose, and inside, Ethan's hand slowly tightened around the handle, his small voice quieter now, almost to himself, "She's still there." And for the first time since the door had closed, Daniel turned his head just enough to glance back, not fully, not yet, but enough for the sound of the rain and the image behind the glass to begin breaking through the distance he had placed between himself and the world outside. The rain did not slow, but something inside the house shifted, quiet at first, almost invisible, like a thought that refused to stay buried, and Daniel Whitmore felt it before he understood it, a subtle discomfort pressing against the certainty he had relied on for years, the kind of certainty that built companies and closed deals and kept emotions neatly outside the door. Yet now that same door stood between him and a woman who had not moved, and that detail, small and stubborn, refused to disappear. Ethan remained by the handle, his fingers still wrapped around the cool metal, his eyes fixed on the blurred silhouette outside, and children had a way of seeing what adults trained themselves to ignore, not because they were wiser, but because they had not yet learned how to look away. "She is still there," he repeated, softer this time, as if saying it differently might change what it meant, and Daniel exhaled slowly, turning fully now, his gaze drifting toward the door, not opening it, not yet, but no longer avoiding it either. "People come and go," he said, though the words felt rehearsed even as they left his mouth. "She will leave." But Ethan did not nod, did not accept the answer, because outside, Sophie Bennett adjusted her grip on her baby again, her movements slower now, more careful, as if conserving what little strength she had left, and the child let out a faint sound, not quite a cry, more like a breath that lingered too long before fading, and through the glass, it reached them anyway, softened by distance but impossible to ignore once noticed. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he caught that small detail, the way the baby's head rested too still against her shoulder, the way she instinctively pulled him closer, shielding him from the cold that had already soaked through her coat, and something about it did not fit the story he had already decided was true. He stepped closer, just one step, then stopped, as if the distance itself had weight, as if crossing it would require more than movement. "Dad," Ethan said again, this time not asking a question, just saying the word in a way that carried expectation without pressure, and Daniel glanced down at him, seeing not accusation, not judgment, just something simple and unguarded, the kind of look he had not seen in a long time because most people around him had learned to hide it. Outside, Sophie finally shifted her stance, her knees bending slightly as if she might lower herself to the step, but she stopped halfway, catching herself, refusing to sit, refusing to give in to the exhaustion that pressed against her from every direction, and instead she leaned lightly against the wall beside the door, her head tilting just enough to rest for a second, her eyes closing briefly before opening again, determined, waiting. The rain traced slow lines down the glass between them, distorting the view, turning the space into something distant even though it was only a few feet apart, and Daniel watched in silence, longer than he intended, longer than made sense, his mind pulling in details he had ignored before, the thinness of her coat, the trembling in her hands, the way she had not argued when he refused, only nodded once, quietly, as if she had expected it. "Why do you think she came here?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper now, not challenging, just curious, and Daniel did not answer right away, because the truth was he had not asked himself that question, not really, he had only responded, reacted, decided, and moved on, the way he always did. But she had not moved on. She was still there. And for the first time, that mattered. The silence inside the house stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable, not loud, not obvious, but present, like something waiting to be acknowledged, and Daniel Whitmore felt it settle in his chest as his eyes remained fixed on the blurred figure beyond the glass, the rain continuing its steady rhythm as if time itself had slowed around that one unmoving point on his doorstep. Sophie Bennett shifted again, this time more noticeably, her shoulders tightening as a gust of wind pushed the rain sideways, soaking the edge of the blanket wrapped around her baby, and she reacted instantly, pulling it closer, adjusting it with careful precision despite the tremor in her fingers, her focus entirely on the small life in her arms, as if nothing else in the world held weight compared to that fragile responsibility. Inside, Ethan did not move away from the door, his presence quiet but anchored, and Daniel noticed that too, the way his son had not returned to the warmth of the living room, had not been distracted by anything else, but instead stood there, watching, waiting, as if the answer to something important depended on what happened next. "She is not leaving," Ethan said, not as a question this time, but as a simple observation, and Daniel let out a slow breath, his hand resting briefly against the back of a nearby chair, grounding himself in something solid while his thoughts began to shift in ways he did not fully control. Outside, Sophie glanced down at her baby, her lips moving in a soft whisper that could not be heard, her expression steady but tired, and for a brief second, she closed her eyes again, not to rest, but to gather something within herself, something that had been stretched thin but not yet broken, and when she opened them, she did not look at the door, she looked forward, into the rain, as if preparing to accept whatever came next. Daniel noticed that too, the absence of expectation, the lack of pleading, and it unsettled him more than desperation would have, Because desperation he understood, desperation could be dismissed, but quiet endurance, that was harder to ignore. She did not even argue, he said quietly, more to himself than to Ethan, the words slipping out before he could stop them, and Ethan turned his head slightly, his expression thoughtful in a way that felt older than it should have been. Maybe she already asked everyone else, Ethan replied, his voice soft, not accusing, just offering a possibility, and that simple sentence landed heavier than anything Daniel had said to himself so far. The idea settled in his mind, unfolding quickly, filling in spaces he had left blank, and for the first time, he considered not just the moment at the door, but everything that might have come before it, the places she might have gone, the people who might have turned her away, the decisions she might have been forced to make just to stand here now, and the weight of that possibility shifted something inside him, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make him take another step toward the door without realizing it. Outside, Sophie finally lowered herself onto the edge of the stone step, slow and careful, her body giving in just enough to keep from collapsing, her back resting lightly against the cold surface behind her, and even then, she adjusted her position so her baby remained shielded, her hand gently brushing across his cheek, checking, reassuring, holding on. The rain softened slightly, not stopping, just easing enough to reveal more clearly the details that had been hidden before, the pale color of her face, the damp strands of hair clinging to her skin, the quiet determination that had not left her eyes despite everything, and Daniel saw it all now, not as a distant figure, but as something real, something undeniable, something that no longer fit the simple explanation he had chosen earlier. "Dad," Ethan said again, this time barely above a whisper, "what if she came here because she thought you would help?" And that question did not just linger in the air, it settled deep, cutting through every justification Daniel had built in the last few minutes, leaving behind something he could not easily dismiss, something that did not demand an answer, but made silence feel heavier than any response he could give. The weight of Ethan's words did not fade, it settled, slow and deliberate, pressing into the space between thought and action where Daniel Whitmore had always been in control, and for the first time that night, control did not feel as steady as it once had, it felt incomplete, like a decision made too quickly, built on something he had not fully seen. He stood there, just a few steps from the door now, close enough to hear the rain more clearly as it tapped against the glass, close enough to notice the faint sound of Sophie Bennett's breathing when the wind shifted just right, uneven but persistent, matching the quiet rhythm of the baby resting against her chest. Outside, Sophie adjusted her position slightly on the cold stone, careful not to wake her child, though the baby stirred again, a soft sound escaping his lips, not quite a cry, more like a fragile reminder that he was still fighting to stay comfortable in a world that had not made space for him tonight. She pressed her cheek gently against his head, her eyes closing for a brief second as if drawing strength from the simple contact, her hand moving in slow, instinctive circles across his back, the kind of motion that came from habit, from long nights and endless worry, from love that did not pause even when everything else did. Inside, Ethan watched that movement closely, his small face still, his eyes following every detail as if he understood more than he could explain, and without turning away, he spoke again, softer this time, "Mom used to do that." The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the sound of the rain, but they reached Daniel with a clarity that cut through everything else, and for a moment, he did not move at all, because memory did not ask for permission, it arrived fully formed, vivid and uninvited. He saw it clearly now, not as something distant, but as something present, a night years ago that looked too much like this one, a different door, a different moment, but the same hesitation, the same choice to turn away, believing there would always be another chance to make it right. His jaw tightened slightly, his hand dropping from the back of the chair as the weight of that realization settled deeper, heavier, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. Outside, Sophie opened her eyes again, blinking slowly as the rain softened even further, her gaze drifting briefly toward the door, not with expectation, but with something quieter, something closer to acceptance, as if she had already decided that this was where the night would end, whether she wanted it to or not. She shifted her baby again, pulling the damp edge of the blanket tighter, whispering something under her breath, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that lined her face, and then she looked away, her focus returning to the simple task of keeping him warm, keeping him safe, even if it meant staying right there until she could no longer stand it. Daniel took another step forward, this time without stopping, his movement slow but certain, closing the remaining distance between himself and the door, and as he reached it, his reflection met his own gaze in the glass, layered over the image of the woman outside, the two worlds separated by something so thin it should not have mattered, and yet it had. Ethan's hand was still on the handle, small fingers wrapped around it, waiting, not pushing, not forcing, just holding the possibility of change in the simplest way possible, and Daniel looked down at that hand for a second before placing his own over it, larger, steadier, but not as certain as it had been before. The metal felt cold beneath his palm, a sharp contrast to the warmth behind him, and for a brief moment, everything paused, the rain, the breath, the quiet tension that had filled the space since the door had first closed, all waiting for a decision that no longer felt simple. Then, without saying a word, Daniel turned the handle, and the soft click of the lock releasing carried farther than it should have, cutting through the night as the door opened slowly, not wide, not dramatically, just enough to let the cold air slip inside, and with it, the reality he had almost chosen to ignore. The door opened just enough to let the cold air slip inside, but it was enough to change everything, because for Sophie Bennett, even that small movement carried a meaning she had not allowed herself to expect anymore, and for a moment, she did not react, not immediately, as if her body needed time to believe what her eyes were seeing. The warm light from inside stretched outward, cutting through the dim gray of the rain, touching the edge of the stone step where she sat, and she blinked slowly, her gaze lifting toward the figure standing in the doorway, Daniel Whitmore, now no longer distant behind glass, but present, real, and close enough that she could see the shift in his expression, the absence of that earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something unsettled. Neither of them spoke right away, the silence no longer empty but filled with everything that had just passed between them without words, and Sophie instinctively adjusted her hold on her baby, pulling him closer as she prepared herself, not for kindness, but for whatever came next, because hope, for her, had become something fragile, something she no longer reached for too quickly. Daniel's hand remained on the door, steady but no longer rigid, and as he looked down at her, really looked this time, the details came into focus in a way they had not before, the damp strands of hair clinging to her face, the exhaustion that could not be hidden, the quiet strength in the way she held her child despite everything pressing against her, and the baby himself, smaller than he had first noticed. His face pale against the blanket, his breathing soft but uneven, each small rise and fall of his chest drawing attention without demanding it. Behind Daniel, Ethan stood just a few steps back, his presence still and watchful, his eyes moving between his father and the woman outside, not speaking now, because he did not need to, the moment had already begun to unfold in the way he had quietly hoped it would. Sophie shifted slightly, her voice finally breaking the silence, soft but clear despite the cold. "I am sorry to bother you again," she said, not rising, not stepping forward, just speaking from where she sat, her tone carrying no expectation, only honesty. "I will leave soon." The words were simple, but they held a weight that made them linger, because they were not a request, not a plea, just a statement, and Daniel felt that too, the difference between someone asking for help and someone preparing to accept the absence of it. He glanced briefly at the paper still clutched in her hand, now damp and creased, the edges curling slightly from the rain, and without asking, he understood what it represented, not the full story, not every detail, but enough to know that it mattered, enough to realize that this moment had not begun at his door, it had only arrived there. The rain softened further, the steady rhythm easing into something quieter, almost like a pause, and Daniel stepped forward just slightly, the threshold no longer a barrier but something he had already crossed without realizing it. "You should not be out here," he said finally, his voice lower than before, not distant, not dismissive, just direct in a different way, and Sophie looked at him for a second, searching, not for permission, but for sincerity, something she had learned to measure quickly, carefully, because she could not afford to misunderstand it. "I did not have another place to go," she replied simply, her words steady, her gaze unwavering, and there was no dramatics in it, no attempt to persuade, just truth laid bare in the quietest way possible. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders shifting as if releasing something he had been holding on to, something he no longer needed to justify, and without another word, he reached up, pulling off his coat, the fabric still warm from the house behind him, and stepped fully outside, closing the distance between them in a way that mattered more than anything he could have said. The rain touched his shoulders immediately, cool against the warmth he had just left, but he did not hesitate, did not pause, as he leaned down slightly and placed the coat gently over Sophie's shoulders, careful not to disturb the baby in her arms, his movement deliberate, quiet, and for a moment, everything else faded, the rain, the silence, the space between them, replaced by that one simple action that carried more meaning than any apology ever could. The warmth of the coat settled over Sophie Bennet's shoulders slowly, almost unfamiliar at first, as if her body had forgotten what it felt like to be protected from the cold, and for a brief second, she did not move, her fingers tightening slightly around the fabric as she adjusted it carefully without shifting her baby, instinctively making sure he was covered first before letting any of that warmth reach herself. The rain continued to fall, but it no longer felt as sharp, no longer cut through her the same way, and that small change, subtle but real, made her lift her eyes again toward Daniel Whitmore, her expression still cautious, still guarded, but no longer distant in the way it had been when the door first closed. Daniel straightened slowly, the rain now settling into his hair and soaking lightly into his shirt, but he did not seem to notice, his attention fixed entirely on the woman in front of him and the quiet gravity of the moment they now shared. For the first time, he saw not just a situation, not just a decision, but a person, someone who had carried herself through something he had not taken the time to understand, and the realization did not come with noise or drama, it came quietly, settling into his thoughts with a clarity that did not ask for permission. "Come inside," he said finally, his voice steady, not commanding, not hesitant, just certain in a different way than before, and the words hung there between them, simple but significant, because they were no longer about control, they were about opening something he had already closed. Sophie blinked once, the offer reaching her slower than it should have, not because she did not hear it, but because she had learned to question things that came too suddenly, too easily, and for a moment, she did not stand, did not move, her gaze searching his face for something more, something that told her this was real and not something that would be taken back just as quickly. Behind him, Ethan shifted slightly, stepping closer now, his small hand resting against the edge of the door as he looked out at her, his expression soft, open, the kind of quiet encouragement that did not need words, and Sophie noticed that too, the presence of the child who had not looked away, who had not dismissed her, and something about that steadiness made it easier to breathe. "It is okay," Ethan said gently, his voice carrying just enough to reach her through the rain, "you can come in." The simplicity of it, the absence of hesitation, broke through something she had been holding on to, something that had kept her anchored to that step even when she had no strength left, and slowly, carefully, she shifted her weight forward, rising to her feet with a slight unsteadiness that she quickly corrected, her arms tightening instinctively around her baby to keep him secure. Daniel stepped back just enough to give her space, holding the door open wider now, the warmth from inside spilling out more fully, wrapping around her in a way that felt almost overwhelming after the cold, and as she crossed the threshold, the sound of the rain softened behind her, fading into the background as the door remained open just long enough to mark the moment before gently closing again. Inside, the air was quiet, warm, steady, and Sophie paused just a few steps in, her eyes adjusting, her breathing slowing as if her body was trying to understand that it no longer needed to brace itself against the night. Daniel moved to the side, not too close, not too distant, giving her space without withdrawing, and for a second, none of them spoke, because the shift had already happened, the distance had already been crossed. Then Sophie looked down at the baby in her arms, her hand brushing softly across his cheek, and for the first time since she had arrived, her shoulders lowered just slightly, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that something inside her had begun to let go of the tension she had carried for far too long. The warmth of the house did not rush Sophie Bennet all at once, it settled gradually, like something cautious, something that did not want to overwhelm her after everything she had just endured, and she stood there for a moment, just inside the doorway, her damp shoes leaving faint marks on the polished floor as her body adjusted to a space where the air no longer pressed against her skin with cold insistence. Her baby shifted slightly in her arms, a small sound escaping him, softer now, less strained, and she instinctively lowered her head, her hand brushing gently across his back in the same slow rhythm she had repeated countless times before, but this time, her movements carried less urgency, less tension, as if the environment itself had eased something she could not control outside. Daniel Whitmore closed the door behind them quietly, the sound soft but final, sealing the night outside and creating a clear divide between what had been and what was now beginning, and he stood there for a second, his hand still on the door, as if grounding himself in the reality of the choice he had made. He glanced toward Sophie again, noticing how she remained near the entrance, not stepping further inside, not assuming anything beyond what had been offered, her posture careful, respectful, as though she understood she was in a space that was not hers and did not want to overstep even in her condition. "You can sit," Daniel said, gesturing toward a nearby couch, his voice calm, steady, no longer carrying the distance it had earlier, and Sophie hesitated briefly before nodding, her movements slow as she walked further into the room, each step deliberate, her focus still entirely on keeping her baby secure. She lowered herself onto the edge of the couch carefully, adjusting the coat around her shoulders as she positioned the baby more comfortably, her hand checking his forehead again, her expression softening slightly as she felt the warmth of the room settle around him. Ethan moved closer, his small steps quiet against the floor, stopping just a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the baby with open curiosity, not intrusive, not overwhelming, just present in the way only a child could be. "What is his name?" Ethan asked gently, his voice carrying a natural softness that did not demand an answer but invited one, and Sophie looked up at him, her expression shifting just slightly, something warmer breaking through the exhaustion that had defined her face all night. "His name is Lucas," she replied, her voice quiet but steady, and Ethan nodded, as if that answer mattered more than anything else in the moment. "He looks tired," Ethan said, not as a complaint, not as concern, just an observation, and Sophie gave a faint, almost apologetic smile, her hand continuing its gentle motion across Lucas's back. "He has not been feeling well," she said softly, her eyes dropping briefly as if acknowledging a truth she had been carrying alone for too long. Daniel listened from where he stood, not interrupting, not stepping in, but taking in each word, each detail, and this time, he did not dismiss it, did not categorize it as something outside his responsibility, he allowed it to settle, to matter. He moved toward a nearby table, reaching for a glass of water, his actions quiet, almost automatic, but different in intention, and as he handed it to Sophie, their fingers brushed briefly, the contact light but grounding, a silent acknowledgement that the distance between them had changed. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying a sincerity that did not feel forced, and she took a small sip before setting the glass down carefully, her attention returning immediately to Lucas. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence that separated people, it was the kind that allowed them to exist in the same space without pressure, without expectation, and for the first time since she had arrived, Sophie allowed herself to lean back just slightly against the couch, her shoulders relaxing just enough to show that something inside her had begun to trust, even if only a little. Daniel watched that shift, subtle but real, and something in him responded to it, not as obligation, not as duty, but as something more human, something he had almost forgotten how to recognize, and as Ethan stood nearby, his quiet presence bridging the space between them, it became clear that this moment was no longer about a decision at a door, it was about what came after, and whether he would continue to listen now that he had finally chosen to see. The room held a quiet stillness that no longer felt heavy, but thoughtful, as if every movement and every word carried more meaning now that nothing was being rushed, and Sophie Bennett remained seated on the edge of the couch, her body still angled protectively around Lucas, her hand resting lightly on his back as she watched the slow rise and fall of his breathing, counting it without realizing, measuring each second in a way that only someone who had spent too many nights worried could understand. The warmth of the house had begun to settle into his small frame, softening the tension in his face, and Sophie noticed the difference immediately, her shoulders lowering just slightly as if she had been holding something invisible for hours and had only just found a place safe enough to loosen her grip. Daniel Whitmore stood a few steps away, his posture composed but no longer distant, his attention focused in a way that was unfamiliar even to himself, because he was no longer observing from a position of control, he was present, fully aware of the fragile reality sitting just a few feet in front of him. "How long has he been unwell?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice measured, not intrusive, but direct in a way that invited truth rather than assumption, and Sophie hesitated for a brief moment, not because she did not want to answer, but because speaking it aloud made it more real. "A few days," she replied, her voice soft but steady, her eyes not leaving Lucas as she spoke. "It started with a fever, and then he stopped eating as much." Her fingers brushed gently across his cheek again, a small motion filled with both care and worry. "I took him to a clinic this morning, but they said he needs more tests." The words hung in the air, simple, but carrying everything she had not yet said, everything she had been trying to manage on her own before arriving at that door. Ethan shifted closer again, lowering himself slightly so he could see Lucas more clearly, his expression open, curious, but also gentle in a way that showed he understood this was not something to disturb. "He is very small," Ethan said softly, not as a criticism, not even as concern, just as a truth he had noticed, and Sophie gave a faint nod, her lips pressing together for a moment before she spoke again. "He was born early," she said, her voice quieter now, the words carrying a weight that did not need elaboration, and Daniel felt that too, the quiet depth behind what she was not saying, the effort it must have taken to carry everything to this point without breaking. He took a slow breath, his gaze shifting briefly to the damp paper still resting in Sophie's hand, and this time, he did not hesitate. "May I see that?" he asked, his tone respectful, not assuming, and Sophie looked at him for a second before handing it over, her fingers releasing it carefully, as if letting go of something that had defined her entire day. Daniel unfolded the paper gently, the creases soft from the rain, the ink slightly blurred but still legible, and as his eyes moved across the details, his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to show that he understood more now, enough to show that this was no longer just a situation, it was something real, something urgent. He lowered the paper slowly, his gaze returning to Sophie, and for a moment, he did not speak, because words felt insufficient compared to the weight of what he now knew. The room remained quiet, but the silence had shifted again, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but preparing, as if something was about to move forward in a way that could not be undone. Ethan looked up at his father, his eyes searching his face, not asking, not pushing, just waiting, and Daniel met that look briefly before turning back to Sophie, the decision already forming, not out of obligation, not out of pressure, but out of something deeper, something he had almost forgotten how to trust. "We are going to take care of this," he said finally, his voice steady, calm, and certain in a way that felt entirely different from before, and Sophie blinked once, the words reaching her slowly, not because she did not hear them, but because she was not used to hearing something that sounded like an answer instead of another closed door. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the room with a quiet certainty that felt unfamiliar to Sophie Bennett, because promises had never sounded like that in her life, not steady, not calm, not without conditions attached, and for a moment, she simply looked at Daniel Whitmore, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand where those words had come from and whether they would remain once the moment passed. Lucas shifted slightly in her arms again, a small restless movement that pulled her attention back instantly, her hand returning to his back, her thumb tracing slow circles as if grounding both of them at the same time, and Daniel noticed that too, the way her focus never truly left her child, the way every decision she made seemed to pass through that single point first. He folded the damp paper carefully, smoothing it out as much as possible before placing it on the table beside him, no longer treating it as just a document, but as something that carried urgency, something that required action, and that shift in how he handled it said more than anything he could have explained. "I am going to call someone," he said, his voice still even, still composed, but now carrying direction, and without waiting for a response, he reached for his phone, his movements precise but no longer detached, because this was not about efficiency, it was about response. Ethan remained close to Sophie, his attention still on Lucas, his small presence steady and unintrusive, and after a moment, he stepped slightly to the side, his voice gentle as he spoke again. "He is warmer now," and Sophie glanced down, her hand pausing for a second as she noticed it too, the subtle change in Lucas's breathing, the way his small body seemed less tense, less strained, and that alone made her exhale slowly, a breath she had been holding for longer than she realized. Across the room, Daniel spoke quietly into his phone, his tone shifting into something more direct, more familiar, but not cold, just focused, giving clear instructions without raising his voice. his words calm but urgent in a way that did not need to be emphasized. "I need a pediatric specialist on call tonight," he said, pacing once before stopping near the window, his gaze briefly flicking toward the dark glass where the rain still traced faint lines down the surface. "Yes, tonight. I will send the details." There was no hesitation on the other end, no questioning, and Sophie noticed that too, the way things moved around him, the way action followed intention without delay, and it was something so different from what she had experienced all day that it almost felt unreal. She shifted slightly on the couch, adjusting the coat again around her shoulders, her fingers brushing the fabric as if reminding herself it was still there, that the warmth had not disappeared, and for the first time, her eyes moved away from Lucas long enough to take in the room around her, the quiet space, the soft lighting, the absence of pressure, and something inside her loosened just a little more. Daniel ended the call after a few more words, lowering the phone slowly as he turned back toward her, his expression composed but no longer guarded, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that left no room for doubt. "They will be here soon," he said, not as a reassurance, not as a guess, but as a fact, and Sophie blinked once, the words settling into her slowly, the meaning unfolding in a way that felt almost overwhelming after everything that had come before. She nodded faintly, her voice quieter than before when she finally spoke, "Thank you," and the simplicity of it carried everything she could not fully express, because gratitude, for her, had always been tied to survival, to moments that made the difference between continuing and stopping, and this was one of those moments. Ethan looked between them, his small face thoughtful, as if trying to understand the shift that had taken place, and though he did not fully grasp the weight of it, he felt it, the way the room had changed, the way something that had started outside in the rain had now found a different ending inside these walls, and he stayed where he was, quiet, steady, as if he knew that sometimes the most important thing was simply not to walk away. Time moved differently after the call, not faster, not slower, just more intentional, as if every second now carried direction instead of uncertainty, and Sophie Bennett felt it in the way her breathing steadied, in the way her hands no longer trembled as she adjusted the blanket around Lucas, her fingers lingering for a moment on his small shoulder as she reassured herself that he was still warm, still here, still responding to the quiet comfort of the room. The house remained calm around them, the soft hum of the heating system replacing the sound of rain that had once dominated everything, and though the storm continued outside, it no longer reached them in the same way, as if the walls had done more than just block the cold, they had created a space where something could begin again. Daniel Whitmore stood near the window, his posture relaxed but attentive, his gaze shifting occasionally toward Sophie and Lucas, not out of obligation, but out of a growing awareness that this moment required more than presence, it required understanding. He had made the call, he had set things in motion, but now he remained, not retreating back into distance, not stepping away from what he had chosen to face, and that alone marked a change that could not be undone. Ethan sat quietly on the edge of a nearby chair, his legs tucked slightly beneath him, his eyes still fixed on Lucas, observing the small, steady movements that seemed to matter more than anything else in the room, and after a moment, he spoke again, his voice soft but clear, "He is breathing better," and Sophie looked down, her hand pausing as she noticed it too, the rhythm more even now, less strained, and for the first time, her expression shifted into something close to relief, not full, not complete, but enough to let her shoulders lower just a little more. "Yes," she whispered, almost to herself, her voice carrying a quiet gratitude that did not need to be directed at anyone in particular. Daniel heard it anyway, and something in him responded, not as pride, not as satisfaction, but as recognition that this was what mattered, not the decision itself, but what followed it. He stepped closer again, his movement unhurried, stopping at a respectful distance as he spoke. "They will need some information when they arrive," his tone calm, practical, but not cold. "Anything you remember from the clinic, anything they told you, it will help." Sophie nodded slowly, her mind shifting gears, moving from survival to explanation, and though exhaustion still lingered in every part of her, she gathered what she could, her voice steady as she spoke. "They said his lungs might need support, that he needs tests they could not do there." Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the blanket as she added, "They told me not to wait too long." The words settled into the room, quiet but urgent, and Daniel nodded once, absorbing it without interruption, his expression focused, not overwhelmed, just aligned with what needed to happen next. Outside, the rain began to ease, the steady rhythm softening into something lighter, almost distant, and the shift in sound seemed to mirror the shift inside, where tension had slowly given way to something steadier, something grounded. Minutes passed without anyone needing to fill them with unnecessary words, and then, faint but distinct, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke through the quiet, its presence immediate, purposeful, and Daniel glanced toward the door before looking back at Sophie, his voice calm as he spoke, "They are here." Sophie blinked once, the moment arriving faster than she expected, and she tightened her hold on Lucas slightly, not out of fear, but out of instinct, preparing for what came next, and as Daniel moved toward the door, opening it with the same quiet intention he had shown before, the outside world entered again, but this time, it did not bring uncertainty, it brought help, it brought answers, and for the first time that night, Sophie did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something alone. The door opened with quiet precision, and this time the cold air that slipped inside carried something entirely different from before, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but purpose, as two figures stepped in from the night, their movements efficient but calm, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere of the room without overwhelming it. Daniel Whitmore stepped aside to let them pass, his posture steady, his attention focused, and as the medical team entered, their eyes quickly adjusted to the space, scanning without judgment, without delay, taking in Sophie Bennett seated on the couch, the baby in her arms, the small details that mattered most. "We are here to help," one of them said gently, her voice warm but professional, as she moved closer, lowering herself slightly to Sophie's level, making the distance between them smaller in a way that felt intentional, respectful. Sophie nodded faintly, her grip tightening just a little around Lucas as she instinctively prepared to explain, to answer, to do whatever was needed, and though her body was still tired, something inside her had shifted enough to allow trust to begin forming where there had only been caution before. "His name is Lucas," she said softly, her voice steady despite everything, and the woman smiled gently, acknowledging the introduction as something important, not something to overlook. "Okay, Lucas," she said quietly, as if speaking directly to him mattered just as much as speaking to his mother, and she began her work with careful hands, checking his breathing, his temperature, her movements precise but gentle, never rushing, never overwhelming the fragile space that had formed around them. Ethan remained close, his small presence quiet but attentive, watching every movement with wide, focused eyes, not interfering, not asking questions, but fully engaged in a way that showed he understood the importance of what was happening even if he could not fully explain it. Daniel stood a few steps back, giving space, but not distance, his gaze following the interaction closely, not as an observer removed from the moment, but as someone who had chosen to be part of it, someone who was now responsible for what came next. Sophie answered questions as they came, her voice steady, her words clear, recalling details from earlier that day, each piece of information helping to build a clearer picture, and as she spoke, her posture changed slightly, no longer as guarded, no longer as alone, because someone was listening, someone was responding, and that alone made a difference she could feel in every part of her. The room remained calm, the movements measured, the voices soft, and even Lucas seemed to respond, his small body settling further into the warmth around him, his breathing continuing to even out under the careful attention of those who now surrounded him. After a few moments, the second member of the team stepped closer to Daniel, speaking quietly but clearly, "He will need to be taken in for further evaluation, but he is stable right now," and Daniel nodded once, absorbing the information without hesitation, his response immediate, "Whatever is needed, make it happen," his tone firm but controlled, not commanding for the sake of control, but directing for the sake of care. The woman nodded in return, understanding without needing further explanation, and the process continued with quiet efficiency, preparations made, next steps set into motion, and through it all, Sophie remained seated, her eyes never leaving Lucas, her hand still resting gently against him, her presence constant, grounding, as if she was the one steady point in everything that had begun to move around them. Ethan glanced up at his father briefly, his expression thoughtful, and though he did not speak, there was something in that look, something small but significant, as if he recognized the change that had taken place, the difference between what had been and what was now unfolding, and Daniel met that look for just a second before turning his attention back to Sophie and Lucas, the moment clear, undeniable, and no longer something he would ever choose to walk away from again. The room remained steady even as everything began to move, a quiet balance between urgency and care that held the moment together, and Sophie Bennett felt it in the way the medical team worked around her, not rushing her, not taking Lucas from her too quickly, but guiding each step with a calm precision that made it easier to breathe, easier to trust what was happening. One of them spoke gently, explaining each action before it happened, their voice low and reassuring, creating a rhythm that matched the steady improvement in Lucas's breathing, and Sophie listened closely, her eyes never leaving her son, her fingers still resting against him as if that connection was the one thing she refused to let go of no matter what changed around her. "We are going to transport him to the hospital now," the woman said softly, her tone even, her words clear. "We will stay with him the entire time." Sophie nodded, the meaning settling into her slowly, not with fear, but with a quiet acceptance that this was the next step, the right step, and though her body felt heavy with exhaustion, her mind held on to the clarity of what mattered most. Daniel Whitmore stood nearby, his presence constant but unobtrusive, watching as the preparations continued, and when Sophie finally looked up, just briefly, their eyes met in a moment that did not need explanation, a silent understanding passing between them, not built on history, not built on obligation, but on what had happened here tonight, on the simple fact that he had chosen to open a door that could have remained closed. "You will not be alone," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady, not loud, not formal, just certain in a way that reached her without effort, and Sophie blinked once, the words grounding her in a way she had not expected, because they were not a promise for later, they were a truth for now. Ethan stepped closer again, his small presence still calm, his eyes following Lucas as the medical team carefully prepared to move him, and he reached out just slightly, not touching, but close enough to feel included, his voice soft as he spoke. "He is going to be okay," and though he did not know for certain, the simplicity of his belief carried a strength that filled the space in a way no explanation could. Sophie looked at him for a second, her expression softening in a way that revealed a quiet gratitude not just for what had been done, but for how it had been done, for the way she had been seen, for the way Lucas had been treated as more than a problem to solve. The process moved forward with care, Lucas gently transferred into the medical carrier, his small form still wrapped securely, his breathing monitored, his condition stable, and Sophie stood slowly, her legs steady despite the long night, her focus unwavering as she stayed close, ready to follow wherever he needed to go. Daniel moved toward the door again, opening it not as a barrier, but as a path, the night outside now quieter, the rain reduced to a light mist that no longer carried the same weight, and as the team stepped out, Sophie followed, her steps firm despite everything she had carried to reach this moment. She paused just briefly at the threshold, turning back for a second, her eyes meeting Daniel's again, and though she did not say much, her voice held a depth that did not need many words. "Thank you," she said, and this time, it was not just gratitude for help, it was acknowledgement of something deeper, something that had changed the direction of her night, and perhaps more than that. Daniel nodded once, his expression steady, understanding without needing more, and as the door remained open behind them, the space between what had been and what was now continued to widen, not as a divide, but as a reminder that sometimes the smallest decision, the quiet turning of a handle, could carry a weight far greater than anyone expected, and that once made, it could change everything that followed. The night felt different as the car lights faded into the distance, softer somehow, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the rain and everything to do with what had changed inside that house, and Daniel Whitmore stood by the open doorway for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the frame as he watched until the vehicle carrying Sophie Bennett and her son disappeared completely from view. The air outside was cool but no longer harsh, the storm reduced to a faint mist that clung to the ground like a memory that refused to leave too quickly, and for the first time that evening, Daniel did not step back inside right away, because something about that moment asked him to stay, to feel it fully, to understand what had just taken place beyond the simple sequence of events. Behind him, Ethan moved quietly to his side, his small presence steady and calm, his eyes still fixed on the empty driveway as if expecting something more, but there was nothing left to see, only the space where something important had already happened. She's going to be okay, Ethan said softly, not asking, not doubting, just stating it in the way children sometimes do, with a belief that does not need confirmation, and Daniel glanced down at him, his expression thoughtful, the weight of the night settling into something clearer now, something that did not feel heavy, but grounded. I think she will, Daniel replied quietly, and the words carried more than just hope, they carried responsibility, not because he had to, but because he had chosen to care, and that choice had already begun to reshape something inside him in a way he had not expected. They stood there together for a few seconds longer before Daniel gently closed the door, the soft click marking the end of the night as it had begun and the beginning of something else entirely, something quieter, something that would not announce itself loudly but would remain steady and present in the decisions that followed. The house returned to its calm stillness, but it no longer felt the same, it no longer felt separate from the world outside, because now there was a connection, a thread that had been formed in a moment of hesitation and changed by a single decision to act differently. Ethan turned and walked back toward the living room, his steps light but purposeful, and Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze drifting briefly to the coat rack where his missing coat had once hung, now resting somewhere else, carrying warmth where it was needed more, and that small detail lingered with him, not as loss, but as something that felt right in a way he did not need to question. Days later, the call came quietly, not urgent, not alarming, just a simple update delivered with the same calm professionalism that had begun this entire shift, and when Daniel answered, he listened without interruption, his expression softening just slightly as the words settled in. Lucas was stable, responding well, the treatment working as expected, and Sophie had stayed by his side the entire time. He thanked the caller, his voice steady, and when the line ended, he remained still for a moment, letting the information settle into something more than just relief, something closer to understanding, because this was the part that mattered, not the decision itself, but what it had allowed to happen afterward. Later that evening, Ethan sat beside him, his small hands folded in his lap, his eyes curious in the quiet way that had started it all, and Daniel looked at him, really looked this time, seeing not just his son, but the reason something had changed when it needed to, the reason a door had opened when it could have remained closed. You did something important that night, Daniel said gently, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, not fully understanding, but sensing the meaning behind the words. I just opened the door, Ethan replied simply, and Daniel nodded, a faint smile touching his expression, because sometimes that was all it took, not power, not status, not certainty, just the willingness to open something that had been shut. And maybe that is what stays with us long after moments like these pass, not the storm, not the fear, but the quiet choice to be kind when it would have been easier not to, the small action that becomes something bigger than we ever expected. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something or someone, take a moment to share it, to leave a thought, or simply stay for more stories like this, because sometimes the simplest moments carry the greatest meaning, and sometimes, all it takes to change a life is the decision to open a door.